Awesome. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for making it to the last session at NACW. We're really excited to have you all in the room. My name is Madeleine Carnemark. I'm the director of the VCM Plus Coalition. The VCM Plus Coalition, for those that don't know, is a coalition that's working to coordinate and accelerate the reform happening across the market. As part of this coalition, we think a lot about what the future of high-integrity markets looks like, and risk management is a huge piece of that work, sort of covering every pillar of what we do. I am joined today by an awesome panel. I have Racheal Notto, the head of carbon markets at KITA, Noel Gurwick, who is the principal of ClimateLand 2030 and a research scientist at the Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center at the University of Maryland, and Will Martin, Executive Vice President of Business Innovation at American Forest Foundation. Thank you all for being here. I want to start, I know I just gave some titles, but I would love for each of you to be able to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your organization, and I want to start on a positive note as we're ending NACW. One thing that maybe has inspired you or that you've learned over the past 3 days. Any good connections made? What's your takeaway from NACW?
I can start, actually. So, Racheal Notto, head of carbon markets at KITA, which is an insurance company. I'm technically on this panel because my job right now is to collect working groups around permanence.
More mic?
More mic? More? Now? Okay.
Nice.
So I'm in a bunch of different permanence working groups. It's like my hobby to collect them right now. But actually, in terms of learning, I just came from the Article 6 Corsia session, which was really, really interesting, and listening to Natalia, Lisa, and Molly talk about looking at how petrostates would be the ones least likely to give corresponding Anderson letter of authorizations as like one of the frameworks for considering what host countries are more ready than others. So it was kind of cool to learn about.
Nice.
Good afternoon, everybody. Is that okay? It seems like there's echo. Is that better? It's okay. My name is Noel Gurwick. ClimateLand 2030 is my own independent consulting business. I work in 3 areas. I work on corporate climate claims. I work in nature-based solutions and durability of nature-based solutions, which is the piece most relevant to this particular session. And I work on food systems transformation. I particularly work on demand-side drivers of the food system, like food loss and waste and dietary shifts. And I've been working on climate and land, and in one way or another, probably for the last 20 years. I was at USAID for 10 years on the Sustainable Landscapes team there. Something that I've learned at this conference, not something from a specific session, but we've seen a lot of tension between what we think of as tech-based projects and credits and nature-based projects and credits over the last couple of years. Those have come up in multiple working groups and multiple conferences. For me, it was really nice here to see less of that tension and a little bit more of a shared understanding that we need a range of these approaches and yeah. So that's one observation about NACW for me over the last few days.
Good afternoon, everyone. Will Martin from the American Forest Foundation. It's funny, this is my 3rd panel today, so apologies to any of you who have heard me before. I might say some of the same things, but just to give you a quick context on the American Forest Foundation, we're a relatively small US-based NGO that works primarily with family landowners and really supporting the long-term stewardship and care of their forest land in the US context. That ownership pattern actually represents the largest portion of the forest. So from a climate mitigation perspective, really the imperative is to figure out how to make participation in these markets and drive climate mitigation through family lands is really critical. Otherwise, we're missing a huge source of potential climate mitigation. We developed what we call the Family Forest Carbon Program back in 2020. It's been running for about 6 years. Currently, our enrollment sits around 190,000 acres, representing about 1,500 individual family participants in a group project. And just to say, I think because we're an NGO sort of playing this project developer role, a lot of what we see our purpose being is, yes, to deliver that impact, but also to innovate and test solutions to make participation in this market easier for landowners and to encourage other project developers to develop new solutions. So, and with that, I think it's just been fun for me to see, and we'll talk about it some more in this session. The permanence trust concept has been referenced in multiple sessions throughout these last 3 days, and that's really fun to see, because not that we're like solely responsible for it, but my colleagues Lynn Riley and Nate Truitt, and some of the ideation actually emerged coming out of some of the work we've done as an organization. So it's really fun to see the adoption of the concept and for it to grow and mature through everyone's participation.
Amazing. Well, I know we're diving into some of the tools that are out there, but first I want to take many steps back and just talk about risk in the market generally, because we're talking about carbon market risk. We've probably heard a lot about this. But Racheal, maybe you can start. Risk can mean a lot of things to different people. From your perspective, what are some of the most significant categories of risk that we're talking about as we're thinking about the future of integrity in markets? And maybe what are some risks that get underappreciated or aren't brought up as often?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think integrity is so broad, and a lot of it can kind of come back to the permanence element and the non-permanence risk factors, but I think it's even broader than that too when we think about integrity. And just to name like a couple across whatever type of focal point you're using that Keita is considering as an insurance provider, like we're looking at natural catastrophe, climate risk, abandonment, insolvency, fraud, negligence, chance a standard goes insolvent, project invalidation, methodology changes and how that could impact a project, political risk, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. So there's a lot of definitely different factors of risk and then sub-factors within that broad category as well. Because I mean, even if you just think about natural catastrophe and climate change, there's the acute, the instantaneous like drought or flash flooding or wildfire versus like the chronic that's coming out of through droughts and like how that impacts carbon sequestration rates over time. So a lot of different risk factors depending on what your organization is doing or what you're attempting to solve or get involved with in the VCM is going to really determine what risk factors are most important to you. And I think that's kind of the key when it comes to risk, is being able to clearly identify and talk about the specific factors that matter most for you, understand how to measure, manage, mitigate it as well. But it's not just risk as one big bucket pool. You definitely have to be able to tease out the parts that are more or less important, given your specific endeavor within the VCM.
Yeah. And I'm curious, just as we think about that broad range, I've heard a lot of conversations as we've moved through NACW the last few days is around the convergence of voluntary and client compliance markets and how we need to be building these sort of shared solutions for the way the market is moving. Do you think there's much of a difference in the way we need to think about risk between voluntary and compliance markets, or especially from your standpoint, do you guys kind of look at it as all the same categories?
It's a really good question. And again, it depends on the specific risk factor. I think broadly, there's a lot that translate on a one-to-one basis across the compliance and into the voluntary market. I think one that comes top of my mind where there could be divergence is around non-permanence risk, because obviously under compliance markets, regardless if it's CARB, anything coming out under EU ETS and influences of EU CRCF under that as well, then that's coming down to the national or jurisdictional or local regional level of what the timeline is that they're setting for the permanence versus the voluntary carbon market. By nature is voluntary, so there will be changes over time on what that timeline for permanence could mean. So that's an area where there could be divergence because it's a policy decision. Areas that are absolutely fully aligned on a one-to-one basis, obviously anything related to natural catastrophe risk, climate change, political risk, those are going to have equal impacts, whether it's coming down on the VCM or on the compliance markets.
I'm going to encourage, as we go through all these questions, that if other panelists ever want to jump in, I have been directing questions, but feel free to jump in. Noel, you brought something up that I would love for either you or Will to talk about, which is really, there are a bunch of people on this panel who are thinking a lot about nature right now. And I get a little worried when there's a panel around risk management flooded with nature people. Do we associate nature and risk together inherently? And should we be thinking about risk differently for nature-based projects than some of our engineered solutions within the market and others? I'll let either of you maybe contribute to this one.
First, no.
Let's see. I mean, where you ended is not where I was necessarily expecting you to end, so I'm kind of calibrating a little bit.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I heard the question right first. So you're asking about how we think about risk, specifically with respect to nature, and whether we ought to be whether it's useful or to think about risk differently with respect to engineered versus nature-based solutions?
Yeah, and of course there's going to be different risk categories, but I think a lot of times when there's a sort of tension or narrative tension in the market that when we talk about risk in the market, it gets associated with nature projects. And that there isn't, and that almost leads to the conclusion, there isn't risk outside of nature.
So I like the question, and I like where you were going with it. The way I have thought about risk and carbon credits generally is very different now than it was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll start there.
Yeah.
So 20 years ago, if you'd asked me, I said, well, we're making a trade, right? We're allowing a ton of CO2 or some other greenhouse gas into the atmosphere that otherwise would not have been emitted because we are doing this other thing. You know, we are managing land in a particular way, we are engineering something in a different way. And if you're gonna make that trade, you really wanna be sure that the project on this side of the balance is equal to the fossil fuel emissions on this side of the balance. And I don't think about it quite that way anymore. Yes, there are some engineering solutions like destroying ozone-depleting substances, something like that, where you really can be very confident. But in a lot of cases, and even in what we think about, something like direct air capture, which we somehow have come up with this narrative that we're going to get it right and it's going to be kind of foolproof. I don't think that's correct. I mean, that assumes that you're putting the stuff in the right geologic spot. It means that all of the pipes above ground that take the CO2 from where it's starting into the well don't leak.
Right.
It means that all of the governance around it works. So there's lots of ways that could fail. Most of the time, I think what we're really dealing with is a situation where we have to accept that we're managing the planet. And that is an ongoing process. And we could fail. We could manage it really badly. We have managed it really badly at times in the past, and maybe we hope we're doing everything we can to manage it better in the future. So I think this way we want to think about it as we know, that this is going to work is just kind of the wrong way to think about it, and that's where. So that's maybe I'll end there for now.
The uncertainty
See what
in
Will
both.
has to say.
Will, you want to add?
I mean, the only thing I would add is, just to kind of shift the perspective overall, I think, ecosystems are actually one of the most durable and well-tested carbon sinks we have, right? And so it's not like this is a new space. And our capacity to actually measure and track the dynamic nature of these ecosystems is only getting stronger. And I think sometimes what we even experience in our project and some of the feedback that we get, I think there's confusion between what someone might identify as like an impact on an individual site, say like a fire blows through one property enrolled in our project, but we're not selling credits on a property by property basis. We're selling them at a project level. We're using a dynamic baseline. So the likelihood that you have a sort of project level failure is actually very, very small. And so really, I think the imperative here is to shift to a risk management framework where we actually can measure and monitor these risk criteria and then manage them through time, because actually nothing in itself is inherently durable.
Right.
I'll also add into there are definitely categories of risk that are fully project type agnostic. Just like big categories, political risk, counterparty risk, those are ones that are pretty project type agnostic. Even like natural risk, though some of them, because I feel like natural risk is one where it's like, it's only NBS projects that have that risk category, but like think of a tsunami. The wave doesn't care if it's hitting a DAC plant or a mangrove plantation. So there are definitely lots of risk factors that are project type agnostic.
Absolutely. Well, I think some of this kind of got teed up, but Noel, we had a really riveting conversation sort of leading into the panel today, where we were working with this fundamental question: are we even managing risk at the right level? A lot of the current frameworks are focusing on that sort of individual project risk over short time frames, but does this sort of align with our global decarbonization and nature goals? So how do you think about the difference between project level risk and sort of portfolio risk for our fundamental goals?
Yes, you're talking to me.
Yeah.
So I think I know what you're talking about. And I would be interested if anybody in the room has seen an analysis that looks at the question I'm about to raise, because I haven't seen it. I've asked a few people, they haven't seen it. But I think it would be helpful for all of us if we had it. So we know that right now our tolerance for risk, at least in our discussions, is for the failure of projects that generate carbon credits or are intended to generate carbon credits is very low. It's down here someplace. We don't want a tolerance for risk that's at 100% either, right? That's at the other end of the scale. But what happens in between, right? So as you relax your tolerance, it also means you're going to have more market actors. Right? At least that's my assumption. As you make the requirements a little bit less stringent, it makes it easier for more actors to participate, particularly smaller, less resourced actors. It also means that you're going to probably have a higher failure rate. So if you're the atmosphere, if what we really care about is protecting the atmosphere and then all of the parts of the planet that depend on the atmosphere, which I think at least the four of us agree that that's what we care about, and we could. How many of them in the audience? How much of what you really care about in this end is the atmosphere and all of the planet that it protects? That's maybe a quarter of you. Really, that's it. A quarter.
I think they were sort of shorthands.
Okay, so if that's what you really care about, then what you want is the maximum benefit to the atmosphere, and that means you are going to have some project level failures, and you accept that as part of the system because you have so many more projects and so many more credits and so many more buyers. And you think about any other market that we have, right? Every now and then there's a car company that does a recall. Or you buy a toaster oven and it only lasts for 3 years. Well, it doesn't mean we stop making toaster ovens. So I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
I think there is. So what I would love to see is some kind of a rigorous analysis that actually shows us what we should expect between levels of tolerance for, well, let's call it permanence risk right now, for projects that generate carbon credits, and economy-wide benefit to the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Maybe just to quickly add as well, is I think having risk management sort of disproportionately sit at the project level can actually have the sort of opposite of, I think, the intended effect, where I referenced this before, but as a project developer, if we're having to set aside 20 to 30% of the credits that we're generating, that puts a lot of strain on the financial model for that project. It might push some project developers to kind of have to cut corners potentially, or just puts them in a more financially strained position, which could actually make that project more vulnerable long term. So I think having more effective tools at the right level not only means more projects, which actually ups the chances that we achieve our atmospheric goals, but it is actually a better structure for managing risk because it's at the appropriate level.
And I'm curious, Will, following up on that, one of the criticisms of this market is it's pretty complicated. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to both need to understand all of the atmospheric impacts of projects and understand the financial mechanisms and understand all these players. And when let's just put ourselves in the seat of a buyer who's going to face the reputational risk of a project failure. And I know you work really closely on individual projects with individual landowners, and sort of that personal connection to exactly what you're investing in is important. How do you think about that when we do have project failure, and how do we sort of defend the need to accept some of that uncertainty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it is Well, first of all, even as a project developer, we're developing sort of a pool of projects and sort of being able to manage across that. So then when we establish a relationship with a buyer, it's not contingent on necessarily the performance of any one site. It's really what we're selling is the aggregate impact. But I do think ultimately what's going to be needed here is buyers will have to take a portfolio approach to their projects, and I think if there's a bit more sharing of the risk through some of these sort of market level tools, that protects buyers and project developers equally.
Yeah. And Racheal, thinking about this, so if we've sort of accepted, and as we're looking at risk and integrity, if we've sort of accepted that a high integrity market isn't necessarily a zero risk market, how do you all think about, especially from an insurance perspective, where do we get to the right level of risk? Because of course we can't also say, well, there's risk in the market, it's fine, let as much of it in as you need. How do you think about that, and what kind of tools can we think about from financial markets and thinking?
Yeah, all good questions. One thing I want to say before I forget, to piggyback off of Will's answer, NTSA, Natural Climate Solutions Alliance, is revamping their buyer's guide for risk management within the VCM and their investor's guide right now, and those should be coming out before London Climate Action Week, so within the next couple of months. Public resources, so if anyone is looking for more information to really dive deep on what Will's saying, like that's really great guides to look up and learn more about. Going back to your question, in terms of the risk thresholds, I think a lot of it starts with what Noel was saying on defining your risk tolerance, because it's not like risk didn't exist, it always existed. It's just in the VCM historically, it wasn't a main stage conversation, which was due to different levels of education on the topic, depending on who you are as an actor within the voluntary carbon market. So it seemed very like binary, yes or no, there is or isn't risk, but that wasn't true, and now we're just bringing these conversations more to the forefront, which I think is actually a lot of education and knowledge sharing to understand and help people define what is their actual risk tolerance level, which is something that you got to measure it, you got to define it, you got to have conversations within your company and all the stakeholders within it to define that, and your tolerance is going to change, and you should be revisiting within your company what that level of risk tolerance is at least year over year, because that's going to have a lot of influence on your decision making. For KITA as an insurance company, it really depends on the insurance policy and what's trying to be achieved with that insurance product, but we obviously know there is no 0% risk no matter what factor you're looking at. But also in the insurance industry, there is the saying, you could pay whatever you want and get insurance for it. It could be really risky, but it's going to be really pricey. So you do have that trade-off as well, too. Insurance is one of those mechanisms where you can change the unknown of the risk in exchange for a very specific insurance premium. So that's one element. And then in terms of tools, too, around this broadly, there's a lot. It depends on what you're specifically trying to achieve, but just thinking, putting my non-permanence hat on, there's obviously the buffer pools. Insurance is an emerging one. Permanence trust is an emerging one that KITA and AFF are doing a joint feasibility study on right now. And then also Noel, myself, and other members of AFF are involved with Shift CM, which is co-led by the Yale and the Nature Conservancy. And we're working on putting a paper that covers even more tools, which Noel will be able to speak to around accounting mechanisms, stacking mechanisms as well. So there's a flavor out there for everyone. You just got to learn about it and decide which ones work for you and do some mix and matching too.
Yeah, I think let's build on that tools and sort of get to the risk management part, and maybe just because you teed it up so nicely for Noel to speak to some of the work that Shift CM has been working on and what that's going to look like for the market.
I can take a crack at it, sure. And I think just maybe to build on what Racheal said. So, there's a range of tools out there for managing particularly non-permanence risk, and we were thinking mostly about nature-based solutions. The most common one that is widely used and that everybody is familiar with, I think in this room to some extent, is buffer pools, right? So you have some portion of the credits generated by a project held in reserve in case there are reversals, which means that, and then you can pull those credits in. there are real questions about how big those buffer pools should be, whether they are right-sized across different projects, whether they need to be bigger in the future as climate risks to the integrity of nature-based projects increase as well. But in that case, I think we're actually in a really good position because we're also getting to a place where our data and information about what those risks are in terms of different kinds of ecosystems, in terms of different kinds of geographies, is getting better. And so, and there's clearly dialogues between the research groups that are enabling that understanding and the reserves, which are the ones that are having to make decisions about how big those buffer pools need to be. So that's the one that is the most mature and the most widely used and has some limitations, but we are in a position to address those limitations. There's a couple of others, and we lumped these in a basket that we called risk transfer, although I think you might like or not like our baskets, that's up to you. The second one is the permanence trust, and I guess the only piece I'm gonna add right now to the permanence trust is, as I've talked to more and more people about it, we all need to kind of stay clear that there's the idea of a permanence trust, and then there's the feasibility study that AFF and KETA are doing right now. And a permanence trust can look quite a few different ways. And so who manages it? When can funds be dispersed for it? The idea is when you buy a credit, you pay a fee. The fee goes into this trust. It's managed by some entity. Maybe it's a third-party entity. Those funds grow as they do in any other trust, and then they can be used for a variety of different things. Maybe they can be used for activities that reduce the permanence risk of a project. Maybe that's some kind of fire management activity on the ground before a fire ever occurs. Or maybe they're used to purchase additional credits or give a cash payment in if a reversal occurs. There's lots of options, and you could easily imagine a future where there are lots of trusts, and each of them have their own particular characteristics. So just to stay clear that when we talk about the permanence trust, it's really an idea that we're exploring. The last one that we had in our risk transfer portfolio, and I'm not going to say anything more about this except to name it, is insurance. And if you want to know about insurance, we should ask Racheal. I'm not kidding. I mean, she's like a wealth of, as you saw, of information about that. Do you want me to keep talking about this or stop here and save some?
No, keep going.
So we had another basket, which is stacking, and Racheal referred to this, vertical and horizontal stacking. And this, to me, is one of these places where I'm in this working group, we're writing this paper. It took me a long time to start to understand what these phrases meant, and it just seemed like, do we really need such complicated vocabulary to describe these ideas? But we have it, and we use it in the paper, so I'm going to use it with you and impose that on you right now, too. So the first is vertical stacking, and what it simply means is you're a buyer, you have a certain climate risk that you want to offset, and so you buy more credits than you actually need based on your inventory. And that credit stack is going to sum to more than the amount that you want to abate. And it could be quite a homogeneous stack. It could be quite a heterogeneous stack, so you could take kind of a portfolio approach to putting it together, but you buy it all at once at the beginning. A horizontal stack, the second piece in this basket, it's kind of, let me go back to my toaster oven analogy. I buy a toaster oven. After a few years, I don't know why this is the case for toaster ovens, and if anybody knows of a great toaster oven manufacturer, tell us, because it would help all of us.
I think it's weirdly like the cheaper the better. Like somehow the more you spend on a toaster, the more likely it is to
I knew I shouldn't have been spending so much money on my toaster ovens. So after a few years it breaks, I buy another toaster oven. Maybe I don't, but in this analogy, just assume that I'm doing that. That's the idea with horizontal stacking. Your credit, either you bought a short duration credit, and so the guaranteed durability of that credit has now expired. You buy another credit, or there's a reversal. So now your credit, that you thought was guaranteed to some length of time, is no longer worth what you thought it was. You go out and you buy another credit, or another 100 credits, or whatever it is. So it's simply, so that requires a willingness on the part of the buyer to continuously invest in more credits over time. And you never really know when you're going to need to buy more credits. It all depends on the integrity of the credits that you purchased. So that's 5 of our basket of insurance, of non-permanent contract mechanisms: the buffer pools, the permanence trust, the insurance, the horizontal stacking, and the vertical stacking. And maybe to just say why we're doing this, there's advantages and limitations to all of these tools. Some of them are quite mature, some of them are not, but we hadn't seen any resource that pulled them all together in one place, that organized them and gave us all, any buyer or any project developer or any registry, the ability to look at them holistically and think about how they can be used synergistically. So that's what we're trying to contribute with this paper.
Maybe just to add really quickly, too, to make sure it's clear to the audience, at least from our perspective, like, we're not here advocating for one tool over another and sort of picking favorites. I think it really is going to come down to sort of the correct application of multiple strategies aligned to the actual quantification and management of risk. And I think what I want to make sure we also don't lose is that risk and the right tool might change through time, right? So there may be periods of time where risks maybe are better managed at the sort of project proponent level during the contract period, and then there are risks that are then better managed and transferred to a different structure later on, because we are talking about durability for very, very long periods of time. So the tools we apply might also need to change over that period of time.
Yeah.
I just want to completely underscore what Will said. And for Kita's perspective, the way that we think about it too is we're just adding another tool to the toolbox. And there's so many that everyone needs to be pulling from. And we've listed out some specific ones around non-permanence risk management, but don't forget your basics that Will had mentioned earlier, using portfolios, using your carbon contracts, doing your due diligence. Like, it's a wealth of a toolbox.
And I'm curious, we had some interesting discussions over the last few days around sort of advancements in research in the market, and especially around MRV and DMRV and the role that's going to play with these tools as we're just getting more and more data and more accuracy around our projects. How are you guys thinking about that with this sort of suite of tools and keeping up with this just really evolving space?
Yeah, I mean, I can just say at a project level, the improvements in remote sensing and DMRV, just not only, it really just improves our sort of project efficiency as well, but it like, we can very accurately pick up changes in any of our enrolled properties and really target our monitoring and our corrections, and like, we can be much more specific and sort of catch potential risk factors really early. So just the whole space of the technologies that are now available also, I think, is aligning to better risk management. I think, is that what you were asking?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, as we're getting more precise, it means that we're both aware of risk, but also can be more predictive and potentially more accurate. And so...
And also what I think I said earlier, too, around this sort of challenging a little bit the perception that nature projects are more risky. These improved tools also just support better ability to monitor and manage the dynamic nature of ecosystems. And I think it is going to reduce the perceived risk through time.
Yeah. I can also add on from the insurance and permanent trust perspective. On the insurance side, for every insurance policy that we underwrite, regardless of the type of insurance policy, we are a large subscriber to different DMRV tools, and we are looking at each project and monitoring it remotely if we wrote an insurance policy for it. And then on the permanent trust side too, digital MRV is super important for that continuous monitoring over potentially decades, centuries, millennia, if not longer, for the permanent trust. So that continuous monitoring element as it relates to using DMRV is really important.
And maybe, so we've talked a lot about the permanence trust, and I love, Noel, that you took it a step back and explained what a permanence trust is and really just what the trust model. But you also mentioned, I'd love Racheal to go deeper on this permanence trust feasibility assessment. What's happening there, and any updates that you can share with this group?
Yeah, so KETA and AFF are doing a joint permanent trust feasibility study, and this kicked off fall of last year. We're running all the way through 2026. Public results will be a nice beefy report out by the end of this year. It is very much a multi-stakeholder effort. KEDA and AFF are leading it, but one of our official partners on it is also Climate Resilient Solutions, led by Dr. Bali Lee. We also have an advisory group that's stocked with about 60 different people, very well represented across the VCM. There are several of our members in here of the advisory group as well. And what Noel said is really important about it is a feasibility study first, not just to build, own, and operate a permanence trust. So the first question that the study is trying to ask or answer is a permanence trust a feasible use to manage the non-permanence risk within the voluntary carbon market, especially that really long-term risk? We are halfway through the study. Early results are saying yes, absolutely, a permanence trust is feasible. Even just from like a modeling perspective, we use historic data from carbon projects, insurance industry models, and then independent natural catastrophe and climate change risk models, kind of all layering those three together. So not just focusing on one area of the voluntary carbon market as well. And I should also clarify too, for the permanence trust, we're looking at all project types. This isn't just something that's MBS specific. And so that's the official goal of the study, is understand the feasibility of it. We actually did just do a public webinar that gave early updates last week. It is posted on YouTube. AFF team put it up there. So I doubt there's many permanence trust webinars on YouTube, but if you Google that at American Forest Foundation, I'm sure you'll find it pretty quickly. And then kind of the parallel element that we're doing around this permanence trust feasibility study is also building stakeholder engagement and buy-in at the same time, because it'd be really not great if we just had if it was feasible, we finished the study and then it was just crickets, and no one cared about it. And we obviously would love to do a pilot at the end that will just be a different portion.
Yeah. Will, anything you want to add from AFF?
No, I mean, maybe just worth saying. I mean, we've done this ourselves voluntarily within our own program, and so already have results, and and working with our reputable banking partners, and from our own governance, like we've started to tease out what it even means to implement just within a project, and obviously it's going to be stronger if done at a broader sort of market level. And Noel, I really appreciated your point of also don't think of this as just one permanence trust, but like multiple potential trusts. And yeah, so it's just worth saying, like, we're kind of already doing it. And I think there's opportunity to expand this tool and then to have it better recognized, so that we can better adjust some of the other risk management tools like buffer pools, and make sure that they're not just sort of fixed percentages through time, but they're calibrated actually to risk and better aligned with this stack of tools.
And yeah, you mentioned in sort of I think Noel mentioned, but in the description of what the trust can do, it's not simply this project failed, but how maybe being able to actually invest in more management over time. And so it's not necessarily just predicting that projects will fail, but being able to recover a project when it's hitting a hard spot.
And actually just to kind of like zoom back to like a totally different level of all of this, when you get to kind of the on-the-ground project implementation, if ultimately we're setting up market structures that just push more and more cost into kind of like a management burden, and less of the value of for mitigation is actually going into the on-the-ground practices, that is going to up the risk of reversal, right? So the more of that value that stays in the hands of the landowner, in terms of the project developer who's managing the relationship, and you can actually intervene and maintain your interventions, like the more of that value that stays at the project on the ground level in the hands of the farmer, the less likely they are to breach their contract or trigger some kind of a reversal. So just to highlight, like, think about risk management from the kind of all levels, and if we're setting up market structures that just push more of the value into management, we're working against ourselves.
So we already sort of played with this tension, but I'm just going to bring it back to nature specifically. We're seeing a lot of demand-side frameworks across standards and regulations exclude nature or attempt to exclude nature because of this question around permanence and risk. How can we use this set of tools to transform that? And do you think that what is necessary from those sort of demand-side frameworks to keep pace with the way this market is moving?
I can start with that one. This is one of the things I focus a lot through the feasibility study and through the Shift CM working group that Noel and I are in. But unfortunately, start with like semantics and definitions, so boring. But one of the things that we focus on is like the tension between the evolving vernacular of permanence versus durability. And one of the things that we focused on in the study was how do we define these terms in a way that satisfies most, hopefully all VCM members at least, in terms of what it means. And a lot of the feedback that we got, especially through the advisory group, was you can't get rid of the term permanence, even if durability technically makes more sense than a day-to-day plain language use. Can't get rid of permanence because of PACM at the very least. It's pretty clearly in there, and lots of other compliance markets also have it. But what we can do is work with each other to stop thinking about permanence as a binary yes or no, and start thinking about permanence as a timeline which could change. Someone gave me a really good example within the own example for like within the permanence trust. You could think of the permanence trust just like a bank that manages loans, and all the loans cover different things, have different financing structures, cover different timelines. And within that concept of the permanence trust too, you can manage different permanence timelines depending on what the carbon credit is being retired for and trying to achieve, especially depending on what compliance market it's being used for as well. So that's definitely one element, is kind of reframing our thinking of that permanence is a binary, yes or no. I like to remind people that the Earth has existed a lot longer than we have and will continue to. So technically nothing's permanent if we want to take really, really long time scales.
Oh, we're ending on that night.
Yep.
You know, I started as a geology major, so I really appreciate that.
Me too.
Yeah, I think all of us have been involved in some of the dialogues that you're talking about, and that have created real challenges for, you know, those of us who think that we know we're not going to come anywhere close to reaching our climate targets if we don't include nature as part of the problem, as part of the solution, excuse me. So, you know, I think part of the answer to your question is, you know, this is a narrative issue. It's an issue of the dialogue, it's an issue of what story we're telling, and where we start. And somehow, you know, the whole emphasis on removals and on tech has dominated that narrative, at least the way it looks to me, over the last couple of years. So, yeah, how easy is, I'm no expert on how to control and change narratives, but I think, you know, part of what could lead to a softening of this challenge that we've got is more about the narrative and less about additional technical analysis. You know, maybe one piece of that, and there's a couple of pieces to that. One piece is, you know, when we, and I'm using we in the very broad sense of the word, you know, when we talk to corporates and often we're talking to the chief sustainability, the sustainability officers, occasionally you'll hear from somebody in their marketing department, and my general impression is they are not excited about talking about sustainability reports. You know, but there's lots of other ways that nature and nature-based climate solutions and other climate solutions can fit into stories they want to tell. So I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to pull more of the people who tell the stories from corporates into these dialogues. And then where I started, I think matters too, is that right now the reason that narrative exists the way it does is because we're starting from the idea that we're thinking about risk at the project level, and we have a very low tolerance for any kind of failure. And if we're talking about it from the start as from the planet and from the atmosphere, our tolerance for failure there is low, but by having a higher tolerance for failure sometimes at the project level, we actually do better at the atmosphere and the planetary level. So that's not the narrative that we have, and we don't right now have all of the analysis we'd like to have to be able to tell that story with integrity. So those are some of the ways that I think we could shift that.
Amazing.
And I'll also, go ahead, Will.
Oh, just want to sort of double underline in what you said too, is let's not forget that the greatest risk at all levels is unabated catastrophic climate change, right? And so like if we, like, and currently there is no path to 2 degrees without all of these solutions in place. So like we get sometimes stuck in the, is it this or is it that? And we've got to find ways to activate all potential solutions and frankly way more of them to even get anywhere close to being on a trajectory to mitigate climate change.
Yeah, and I'll also just add, hopefully quickly, to directly answer your question too, of 2 other elements. One, when it comes to the policy space, look out for those public policy consultations, those call for input, definitely respond, share your voice. Last summer, I think it was, PACM had their call for input regarding how they're defining reversal risk and what that could look like in the reversal risk tool. There's usually like 10 people that respond to PACM call for inputs. That one there was over 100 because the nature community really saw that that was not going in a direction that they wanted it to go. And what ended up being is that PACM, through the SPM and through the MEP, is reconsidering their stance and working on making sure it's workable for all project types. I mean, to be seen, but we wouldn't even have that door still open if people hadn't responded to those public policy consultations. And I think also on the side of even more specifically for the timelines that you're talking about when we're talking about achieving permanence at whatever timeline, it keeps coming back to the theme that all 4 of us are saying of using all of the tools, because even if we're just talking about any type of project, there's going to be some amount of time that is legally makes sense, and from a stakeholder engagement part makes sense. I've learned a lot over the last few months from my Mexican colleagues, especially Oscar Espinosa, around ejidos and how in Mexico they can only go up to 30 years for legally being able to participate in engagements like this. But then, like, that's still a really large legal and stakeholder engagement component that you need other solutions and other tools to be able to expend whatever your permanence commitments are. And that's using combinations of buffer pools, of insurance, of permanence trusts, stacking, accounting mechanisms to be able to put it all together to achieve a term that I've heard Jen Jenkins at Rubicon Carbon using, effective permanence too.
I think that last point that you brought up brings me to something for Will, is really coming back to the human side of this, the people that are actually on the ground impacted by these projects. And sometimes you see policies that are like 1,000 years, and you're like, okay, who is going to be doing that? Where is that 1,000 years? I know you guys really work with families and often sort of generations on the same piece of land.
Yeah.
How is this conversation hitting for those folks who maybe didn't even want to be in the carbon markets to begin with, but are just trying to protect their family's land?
Yeah, so it's a couple ways we think about it that I would just highlight is, first, in the U.S. context anyway, in these sort of smaller family farms, I quoted the stat before, but the average tenure of ownership is actually only 27 years. So immediately, like, we have to be thinking about what does it mean to create the incentive structure and the relationships to manage these interventions through actually multiple potential owners over time. And actually, we can learn from the kind of history of the land trust community, and the most effective reversal risk mitigation is actually about relationship building. It's forming community and really supporting that landowner to meet all of their goals. And how do we use the climate finance not only to pay for sort of specific interventions that improve rates of carbon sequestration and storage, but actually also provide additional supports for that landowner to steward their property, to create value in their family that they can pass on to the next generation. So, like, we've got to be thinking about that social aspect as well as we approach this whole question.
Absolutely. Well, we have about 10 more minutes, and I want to hear from folks in the room with any questions for our amazing panelists. It's going to be a really weird 10 minutes if we don't talk. Anything that's coming up top of mind? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie. I'm Private Action Reserve. Work with Racheal and with Lynn on our permanence work program and tied into the work that you're doing. I'm curious, just at a high level and everything you're looking at, where do you personally see the right role for the registries in all of this?
So the question was around what is the right role for the registries in all of this?
I can kick us off. I will be parroting a lot of what I've heard from much smarter people that are working on the permanent trust feasibility study in this aspect specifically. So forgive me if someone knows more about registries out there and I'm wrong. But a big part of the role of the registry that I'm learning is it as an infrastructure mechanism and its ability to scale as well. So a big part of that is around legal title and custody and securitization of carbon credits, which is its own endeavor that is being figured out and will take years to figure out. Not a registry-specific thing, but the role of the registry being able to transparently share more information than each registry already does, and also for more registries to be able to communicate with each other, and then bringing in that securitization and legal ownership of the carbon credits as an underpinning as well. From what I've personally been learning, that is huge in terms of being able, an infrastructure element that's huge for scaling the VCM.
What should go next?
It's a good question. Honestly, I'm not sure that I have a great answer, but I do think just continuing to kind of evolve with us as we develop these new tools and thinking about sort of, more risk adjustment through time and sort of adaptation of the tools that we have. I do think there are some of the MRV responsibilities too that probably can be more effectively managed at a registry level, and even things like shared baselining. And I'm not convinced that those requirements are always best managed by individual projects. And so I think there's some opportunity for growth in that direction.
So maybe I'll turn the question back to you for a second. And from where one of the places I started, how much are the registries already, the Reserve, but others that you know of, already thinking about evolving the way you think about buffer pool sizes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can speak on behalf of the Reserve. We have a permanence work program, we have permanence requirements, and we have this work program to look at everything, which includes the buffer pool. So we are, I think it's a discussion amongst other registries that I can obviously speak for myself. But that's a big one. I mean, that's how we've done it to date. You can read publicly, how we manage the permanence to date, and we're looking at everything.
Yeah, great.
I'm curious from the panelists on the same note, sort of what's the role of the registries? We have some other actors sort of that need to come along in this conversation, the ratings agencies and the VVBs, as they're thinking about how to keep up with the evolving pieces of this work and how to think about risk differently. How have you all thought about engaging with those two different stakeholders?
Depends on which hat I'm wearing, honestly.
Yeah, maybe not directly your relationship with them, but sort of the role they're playing in as we're starting to sort of change our paradigm around how we're thinking about risk as a market.
Yeah, I think one of the elements, at least for the VVBs, is data sharing, data standardization, and data transparency, which isn't directly to risk, but like if you don't have the data, then how can you measure and manage and understand risk? There's obviously lots of efforts going on across the VCM, CDOP, CAD Trust are a couple that are working on that data standardization, and I know pretty much every company within the VCM is trying to improve their data transparency as well, because we have all been used to things being trapped in PDFs, and that's not really helpful to anyone. So that's one of the areas that I see a lot that can be really helpful for VVBs in terms of if the market's going to grow and there's more projects that need to be reviewed, then the VVBs need to be able to have fast workflows to be able to review them as well, which I'm not saying that they're slow at all right now, just saying that that is a foreseeable bottleneck. On the ratings agencies, that is one that I think is really interesting depending on if you answer about the role of rating agencies today versus the role of what they could be in the future. And I think as of today, where we have a very nascent market, if you're a buyer and you trust one rating agency's methodology, that's a great way to outsource your due diligence, because you cannot have, most companies do not have enough budget to be able to have a full in-house due diligence team. So I think that's one way to think about them today, but I also think about them in the future, where there's lots of conversations around the growth of the VCM, and if we want it to really scale and mimic large, well-established financial markets, capitalized markets, ratings agencies are one that exists and have existed forever. S&P, Moody's, Fitch's, in terms of everyone just goes and looks at it, at the rating, and if you got a certain rating, you're in. You're buying that bond. You're buying that stock. So that's a role that ratings agencies could play in the future, but a key distinction there between present-day VCM and potential future VCM is those well-established, the S&Ps, the Moody's. There isn't that much deviation between ratings for an individual bond. So there is that element of convergence within the VCM on what those methodologies should be prioritizing and how they should be measuring it, which were not there today. If you did one rating from B0, from Calix, from Silvera, you could end up with different ratings depending on the project you're looking at.
Yeah. Anything to add?
It'd be more interesting to hear the question. There was another question.
Oh, yes, amazing.
Yeah, like, I was wondering, risk has always been like almost own thing, by the financial institutions, banks, etc. So that's where it moves more. And we will have a challenge, a very important challenge, as to how to allocate capital and finance, quicker and in more volume, etc. As we are closer to 2050, etc. So what in this new understanding of risk, within the sector could change the perspective of financial institutions in order to allocate capital more to nature, etc., etc. So that's, because what I sense sometimes is that when we're talking, when you're looking for investor capital, vendor finance, etc., but you end up being in the hands of a banker that understands risk traditionally, and then will say, okay, in my toolbox here, I don't like your guarantee of forward credits, in the future. I'm not seeing the trees as an asset, etc., etc. So I was very curious to know about how you see this changing, if it's changing or not. I don't think that is at the pace that it should be doing it, but I was very curious to know your perspective from that side.
You want to start with that one? I mean, the only thing I would just say is maybe picking up on what you were describing earlier, Racheal, is I think the more the tools start to mirror structures that are familiar to those financial institutions, I think it's like there's less new that they have to sort of understand. They can maybe, yes, there's unique applications here, but insurance and ratings and these are pretty familiar structures that they're pretty well versed at evaluating. So I do think that direction is going to be helpful in terms of unlocking finance.
Yeah, Chris Canavan at the GCMU always says we as a market need to learn how to plagiarize. It's important that we're just building these into the models that already exist.
I know that your question is a good one. I think that none of us are finance people, so we can't give you a full answer. We know people that can give you better answers, though. But I can give you one specific answer from the insurance industry. KETA offers non-payment insurance now. Non-payment insurance is a type of insurance product that exists within the broader insurance industry, not just the carbon markets. And it actually is a specific type of insurance that banks require when they're doing large lending. So non-payment insurance as applied to within the carbon markets is when the project developer or a project investor is going to a bank, they're trying to get the debt financing to be able to help with the project at earlier stages before the project is fully on its feet. And one of the things that many banks, regardless of the size of the bank, will require is non-payment insurance, and that is because if for whatever reason whoever received the lended amount is unable to repay that, then the bank calls in the non-payment insurance. So in a lot of banks, that the availability of the non-payment insurance is one of the very clear yes or no's if the bank is going to look at it.
I guess one of the questions I would love to ask of financial institutions, or particular people in financial institutions, is how big do they see the opportunity to be in carbon markets? And does their assessment align with what some of us might say? Because I'd expect that the bigger the opportunity they see, the more they're going to be willing to learn and maybe change some assumptions that they hold now. So if they hear trees and they're like, we don't understand trees, we don't understand soil, we don't want to learn about it, but if that's coupled with a potentially really big business opportunity. So I wonder how they're thinking about those kind of two pieces together.
And I think we saw some of that boom early in the market, and we as a market need to be a bit better, if I use that collective we again, around some of the infighting that happens within the market that undermines confidence. Because if you're coming into a space and you're already not sure what's happening, and you say, well, everyone in that room is fighting, it's not the most inviting room to be a part of. I saw one more hand over here, and then I think we'll have to close.
So I'm not representing any financial institution, but my background is in finance and capital markets. Just actually recently, like probably 1 year ago, I'm just starting to study a little bit more on the carbon market space. And one of the things I noticed, like kind of a whole eye view, kind of whole eyes perspective, is the what is missing is how we can democratize the knowledge of what is carbon markets about, right? Like the buyers wouldn't buy if they don't understand what they were buying, right? And that's kind of the bottom line of capital markets as a whole. So one of the challenges is how we translate all these complex projects into KPIs or maybe more understandable metrics that can lead to better decisions to these potential markets. So that's one of the kind of takeaways of trying to wrap my head around, okay, how we are understanding these projects, the risk assessment, that's probably so interesting in this conversation, and then ultimately how we'll tell the story to the buyers in order to understand, of course, make transparent make the decision-making process. But that's, and I do the analogy of the capital markets as of today, because that's kind of the reference they have. They have certain standards, KPIs, very straightforward. Data is important, I think I mentioned before, the transparency, and how we can educate them, basically, through that process. And I think that huge gap between the players, so the developers, how they are working in their thing, right, the scientists and all these smart people that actually work the projects through, and then the other side that is moving the needle is really the demand, right, and the buyers, and what are their expectations in terms of quality, in terms of, for them it's kind of a different language, so I think we need to kind of narrow down the language barrier, because it's very technical to very almost straightforward, so I think that's an opportunity to think about food for thought.
Yeah, I love that as sort of a closing food for thought in terms of the quantification that we can get to. We've heard about an amazing suite of tools that are underway. My call to action for this room is that we need to be talking more about all the tools we have in our toolbox. We have a lot as we enter this next phase of carbon markets with integrity. We are out of time, but I just want to thank all of the panelists today. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say our names are up here. If you have any more questions and want to contact us about anything that you heard today, we're all happy to chat. Awesome.